Have you ever been lured into a cult? I like movies portraying the vile, unspeakable things of madness that go on behind closed doors or gates of the premises. But in reality, it is a tragedy of enormous proportions. Even the smartest person in town might be tempted to see what's up if a group of people claim they have found the answer to all of life's problems in one specific individual, the leader, who then claims to be chosen by God in order to save them from their sins. Egomaniacs at best. So today I wanted to discuss the act of deprogramming cult victims, which are truly part of life's most twisted stories. A cult is essentially a group of people all holding the same ideology, whether that is in God or aliens or a dozen other things. They tend to contain beliefs in the supernatural, and in most cases these people started to believe that the end of the world was near. There are famous cults who ended up in total destruction by the suggestions of their own leader. I'm sure you're aware of cases ending up in mass suicide. How is it possible for people to all agree on this course of action? And if it's not just suicide, sometimes they take the lives of other people as well. I think in order to shed some light on this crazy situation, we have to consider the herd mentality that develops inside a cult itself. It is also strongly linked to a unified belief system everyone agreed upon. The easiest time to influence someone's mind and get them to believe in what you want is when they are either young and naive, or they are desperate and think the illusionary comforts of a potential cult are the best place to stay. Truly, a belief system is developed by ramming into the mind a certain idea over and over again. This is why it was once said by a person, tell a lie long enough and often enough and people will believe it. Another thing we have to understand about the workings of the conscious and subconscious mind is that they operate quite differently. You see, if you want to alter someone's subconscious programming and get them to believe in the twisted cult-like mentality you're demanding they obey, the leader has two options open to them. One is what I just mentioned earlier, repeat an idea or concept over and over again until the person is brainwashed finally into going along with it. Number two is where things get a little more drastic. Another way of influencing the subconscious mind is by causing great emotional and mental distress in the individual. This is why it's so easy to remember a date like 9/11. People instantly know what that date is all about. Why? Because it was shocking enough to bury itself in the consciousness of humanity at large. Now, what does this have to do with cults? Well, we are considering the difficulty in deprogramming cult victims, and this is part of what they go through. It is not uncommon for a cult leader to use intense manipulation both verbally and physically on the victims in question. Because of the herd mentality already established in the group, a new recruit might feel highly intimidated to fight back. So once they are in a cult, it becomes more and more tricky to get out of it. Why? Because if you try, the rest of the group might turn against you. And not only that, the cult leader isn't afraid of using physical violence in order to get the person in question to submit to their authority. It is hard for most to grasp why a person would even consider staying at such a place and not fight back right away. But this is due to the difference in mental programming. A normal individual is free and able to do and go where they want, but a cult victim has no such freedom. Always it has to be with the consent of the leader or group as a whole, and if that isn't given, it becomes more difficult to escape such a place. The constant threat of being hurt or perhaps hunted down if you were to escape would be enough to drive anyone insane. And let's not forget, it's a real risk such a person walks. So we can't blame them for not instantly fighting back and standing up for their own rights. For what are their rights to begin with? A cult victim has only one right, and that is to be a part of a group, a fake family. It's all a facade, but yet most people have a deep ingrained desire to want to be part of something, to belong to something, to be wanted by others, so they don't feel like their whole existence was a waste of time. It is this ingrained human tendency that gets twisted and distorted inside a cult. Theoretically, if you didn't have such desire, perhaps you'd stay clear from cults to begin with. But for thousands of people, if not millions, they do walk around with this desire somewhere in the depths of their mind. This video is not meant to teach anyone how to become a cult leader. Just thought I'd remind you of this based on the stuff you've just heard about the workings of consciousness. Deprogramming a cult victim is a tedious process. I have watched a few interviews given by people who were essentially raised in one. They were taken into a cult at a very vulnerable age, and they simply went along with the vile things the cult leader demanded of them. They didn't know any better, and they also were told the outside world was dangerous. People outside of the group were all dangerous and should be avoided and perhaps even forgotten about for the most part. One interview stuck with me about a young woman in the Netherlands who was sexually abused by the cult leader. This was a man claiming with great arrogance that he was a messenger of God. This young woman was handed over to this cult leader by her own mother. And why would that even happen to begin with? Well, that was the extent of his influence. The father of this young girl didn't believe in any of his claims, but since her parents were divorced and her mom truly believed this man was chosen by God, she decided it was best for her daughter to live in the cult's mansion. What happened behind closed doors can be summed up in a few words. Brainwashing, developing strange beliefs about the world, and sexual abuse. Eventually, when this young girl turned into an adult, she did manage to escape the cult. More and more people in and around the building the cult was located at became suspicious. Thankfully for her, it did have a good ending, but she too explained by her own accounts that she was deeply attached to the cult leader, and it scared her to say goodbye to the comforts the cult had provided her. What sort of comforts did they provide? A roof over her head, food on the table, the companionship from other members of the group, and the guidance of the cult leader itself. She admitted it became very difficult to live outside of the cult, suddenly having to think for herself. No longer could she just do what someone else told her to do. It gives a glimpse in the true madness cult victims have to cope with. In a few minutes I'll explain how they managed to help this young woman get back into society. But first I wanted to share a few disturbing details they have documented on Wikipedia, showcasing how deprogramming can also be an absolutely morbid activity if done from the wrong angle. These victims were basically abused, with the goal of getting them to change their minds away from what was considered bad behavior or wrong cult-like thinking. Now I quote, "Ted Patrick is one of the pioneers of deprogramming. He used the confrontational method, enlisting psychiatrists and psychologists to assist him in the deprogramming process. He was tried and convicted of multiple felonies related to kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment of deprogramming subjects. Sylvia Bovard, an associate of Ted Patrick who has assisted him on many deprogrammings, described 5 stages. Number 1. Discredit the figure of authority, the cult leader itself. Number 2. Present contradictions, ideology versus reality. How can he preach love when he exploits people is an example. Number 3. The breaking point. When a subject begins to listen to the deprogrammer, when reality begins to take precedence over ideology. Number 4. Self-expression, when the subject begins to open up and voice gripes against the cult. Number 5. Identification and transference, when the subject begins to identify with the deprogrammers, starts to think as an opponent of the cult rather than as a member. Sociologist Aline Barker wrote in Watching for Violence the following: "Although deprogramming has become less violent in the course of time, numerous testimonies by those who were subjected to a deprogramming describe how they were threatened with a gun, beaten, denied sleep and food, and were sexually assaulted. But one does not have to rely on the victims for stories of violence. Ted Patrick, one of the most notorious deprogrammers, openly boasted about some of the violence he employed. In November 1987, Cyril Vosper, a committee member of the British cult awareness group FAIR, was convicted in Munich of causing bodily harm in the course of one of his many deprogramming attempts, and a number of similar convictions are on record as well. In Colombrito vs. Kelly, the court accepted the definition of deprogramming by J. Lemolt, published in 1978 in Fordham Law Review. Deprogrammers are people who, at the request of a parent or other close relatives, will have a member of a religious sect seized, then hold him against his will and subject him to mental, emotional, and even physical pressures until he renounces his religious beliefs. Deprogrammers usually work for a fee, which may usually run as high as $25,000. The deprogramming process begins with an abduction. Often strong men muscle the subject into a car and take him to a place where he's cut off from everyone but his captors. He may be held against his will for upward of 3 weeks. Frequently, however, the initial deprogramming only lasts a few days. The subject's sleep is limited and he's told that he will not be released until his beliefs meet his captor's approval. Members of the deprogramming group, as well as members of the family, come into the room where the victim is held and barrage him with questions and denunciations until he recants his newly found religious beliefs. Deprogrammer Carol Giambalvo writes in the 1998 text Deprogramming to Thought Reform Consultation, "It was believed that the hold of the brainwashing over the cognitive processes of a cult member needed to be broken or snapped, as some termed it, by means that would shock or frighten the cultist into thinking again. For that reason, in some cases, cult leaders' pictures were burned or there were highly confrontational interactions between deprogrammers and cultists. What was often sought was an emotional response to the information, the shock, the fear, and the confrontation. There are horror stories, promoted most vehemently by the cults themselves, about restraint, beatings, and even rape. And we have to admit that we have met former members who have related to us their deprogram experience. Several have handcuffs, weapons wielded, and sexual abuse. But thankfully, these are in the minority, and in our minds never justified. Nevertheless, deprogramming helped to free many individuals held captive to destructive cults at a time when other alternatives did not seem viable. In 1974, Kathy Crampton, whose abduction and deprogramming were televised across the US, went back to the Love family group several days after her apparently successful deprogramming. Patrick was charged with kidnapping but acquitted with the reasoning, "The parents were of the reasonable and intelligent belief that they were not physically capable of recapturing their daughter from existing imminent danger. Then the defense of necessity transfers or transposes to the constituted agent, the person who acts upon their belief under such conditions." Yes, that was a really weird sentence on Wikipedia, but it is what it is. They went on to give a few more interesting examples. In 1980, Susan Worth, a 35-year-old teacher living in San Francisco, was abducted by her parents to be deprogrammed in reaction to her leftist political views and activities. Patrick was paid $27,000 to carry out the deprogramming, which involved handcuffing her to a bed for 2 weeks and denying her food. She was later released and after, returning to San Francisco, spoke out against deprogramming but declined to press legal charges against her parents. In 1980, Patrick was convicted of conspiracy, kidnapping and false imprisonment for abducting and attempting to deprogram Roberta McElfish, a 26-year-old Tucson waitress. Patrick was sentenced to 1 year in prison and fined $5,000. In 1981, Stephanie Reithmiller, who lived in Ohio, was kidnapped by deprogrammers hired by her parents to end her lesbian relationship. She was held against her will and repeatedly raped. After her release, she filed civil charges against her parents and the deprogrammers, which were dismissed in a trial that generated some controversy in the media at the time. In 1990, Patrick attempted to deprogram Elma Miller, who had joined a liberal sect. He was hired by her husband to return her to him in the Amish church. Criminal charges of conspiracy were filed against Miller's husband, brother, and 2 others, but were later dropped on a request to the prosecuting attorney. This guy has been up to some crazy stuff, but at the end of the day, he was, I guess, trying to do something good, but the way that they went about it is pretty disturbing to say the least. They went on to write, during the 1990s, Rick Ross, a noted cult intervention advocate who took part in a number of deprogramming sessions, was sued by Jason Scott. After an unsuccessful coercive deprogramming, the jury awarded Scott $875,000 in compensatory damages and $1 million in punitive damages against the Cult Awareness Network and $2.5 million against Ross, later settled for $5,000 and 200 hours of services as an expert consultant and intervention specialist. Now those were the details they had on Wikipedia that were quite disturbing, as you could have heard for yourself. So now that we covered those, let's get back to how they managed to help this Dutch cult victim mentioned earlier. Now, helping a victim away from that cult mentality is a very long and tedious job. It all comes down to rebuilding the victim's belief system. And in order to help get the job done, we should remember that our belief system is based upon our evaluation of something. And frequently, if we reevaluate a situation, our belief about it will change. In other words, the work entails slowly but specifically getting the victim to see that what they believed was a life of comfort and bliss wasn't truly anything like it. They were essentially at the mercy of the hands of a man, or a couple, with sinister and egotistical intentions. It's sad if we consider children being lured in by these monsters. They truly have no concept yet of how the world works, and that makes it all the more sickening. That there's even people and groups currently out there, perhaps just outside of your own town. A cult is being run in full force. Do you dare to take a look? If so, tell us what you were able to find. Now, with the Dutch victim, what they ended up doing was offer her a lot of therapy, but thankfully none of the horror stories earlier about deprogramming occurred for her. They were very kind and gentle with her, until she finally realized that it's true. She was totally misled as a child, and she had a totally screwed up view of the world that didn't make actual sense compared to the rest of the whole planet. Literally, that's how crazy this gets. They get stuck in this cycle of thinking from a very limited point of view, and they can't comprehend at first that there might be more to life than the cult leader instilled in her mind. But they managed to do it, and eventually the cult broke down, and the people were helped that were available. The police had to finally intervene, and I think they actually arrested the couple, and she went on trial to speak up about these monsters, because this was actually more like a couple. The cult leader operated together with a woman. What they would do is go to the bedroom and pick one of the young girls that had to sleep with them together, and then eventually that would end up with sex when they were old enough. Pretty disgusting, but it's a good ending for this Dutch victim. But it didn't always end very well for the rest of the victims all over the planet. We have to understand cult mentality is dangerous, and just like holding a gun down your throat while pulling the trigger is deadly, so it is with cult leaders and their families. Let the water wash away your sins. Yes, that is the sickening mentality of a cult. Now, that is all I had to say on the matter of deprogramming cult victims and some twisted stories. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribing to receive videos about unsolved cases and other creepy things on a regular basis. And with that being said, dear viewer, have sweet dreams.